I'm Tai Rattigan, and this is Groundwork, where we interview the top ecosystem leaders to understand a little bit more about how they're building their partner programs. And I'm really excited to have Dustin with me today. And Dustin, I'd love to just start by having you tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, cool. Ty, first of all, thanks for having me. I think what you're doing with this session is really great because I think that sometimes what I'm doing here is helping to lay the groundwork for what our future state is, while also trying to make sure we have a current state. So, my background is I started my career in engineering. I worked as a process engineer at BASF, which is a big global chemical company, and it was great. I love the mechanics of how factories work and how plants work and how you figure stuff out. Then I got my MBA. The funny story with that is I thought the MBA was how to manage people better, and I was managing big teams of people. I said, "Let's get an MBA. This is management school." Uh, for those of you with an MBA or thinking about it, it's not about managing people; it's about managing businesses. And so I pivoted into a sales journey. And so I started selling services into senior executives at Fortune 1000 companies in the US and then in Europe. And what that allowed me to do is see how dissecting the sales process can help you be really, really successful. There's an art to it, but there's a lot of science to it. And so I worked in sales, and then I transitioned to a couple other sales businesses that were HR focused. And so leadership work, coaching work, training work. I did some employer branding work. Had a couple stints in European companies, so a British company expanding into the US, Swedish company expanding into the US. Then I made a pivot to be basically a GM for a German company expanding into the US, which was eye-opening in its own respect. But that was what I had before I joined Betterworks. And I joined Betterworks partly because the combination of all those experiences is the way we were thinking at the time, before I joined, the way the company was thinking about what do we need in partnerships. So first time I've been in partnerships here, but that's my journey up until now.
Amazing. Yeah. And I think I love your kind of reference to like groundwork and building, and because that's really where the inspiration for the name of the show came from. Was like, I do feel like everyone's building the foundations at the moment, and so that's definitely where it came from.
Yeah.
And I love your background because, I think if someone was looking at your LinkedIn profile, maybe they would say, oh, like partnerships is something new for you. But having that background of having sold services yourself, and then also then working in a revenue organization a couple of times over, and launching businesses in other markets where I'm sure you were working with a bunch of partners, like it's really like the building blocks for what makes a great partnership leader. So it makes a ton of sense, and pumped that you have now been in partnerships for the last few years. I would love to start with talking about selling services into the Fortune 500. And the reason why I think that that's really interesting is because many tech partnerships teams, like partnerships teams that are working in the tech space, they're either partnering with ISV tech partners, or they're partnering with SIs and digital agencies and consultancies. And I think when you're working with another tech company, the go-to-market is really easy, right? Like they probably have a tech partnerships person as well. They probably have sales and customer success and marketing teams, and so like that process is fairly straightforward because there's such similar DNA. But when you're trying to partner with a more service-oriented business, the go-to-market and DNA is completely different. You're not going to find salespeople most of the time, like,
Yeah.
or if they are, they're going to be an account director or a client director, or all of this kind of stuff. And so I would love to just hear a little bit about what you were doing there, and like also if you have any tips for people that are trying to work with people that are selling services rather than a software product. I'd be really interested to hear them.
Yeah, it is. Well, let me summarize the. I'm not getting to the tips part, but one, I think when you see services industries, the upside potential in services is tremendous. So if you sell a software product, it's usually defined. It is what it is, and it costs what it costs. And your upside is on how broad you can get it spread. Either it's upsells in the product, or it's normally how broad the usage is. In the services space, it's how deep the problem is, and is the customer's problem deep enough to warrant a really complex solution. So one of the things that I learned was, if it's complex, make simple things really complex. And if you walk into what is a fairly straightforward services approach, but you get behind how complex it could be for the customer, or how difficult it might be behind the scenes for the customer, you can actually get quite big with them, as opposed to for a relatively similar effort than you would if you were kind of selling a point solution. We do this, we do that, and you can expand that. On the flip side, it's easy when you're if you're deep in if your book of business as an account director in a services company is 10 clients, all of those 10 clients really matter to you, and you get to know them really, really well. You can get a little risk averse. I don't want to take a
Hmm.
risk here because it's one of 10, and that could be 10%. You can do the math on that. But if you step back, you can take that complexity and you can make it really simple, and you can simplify the stuff that's complex, and you can make complex the stuff that might be simple. And it allows you to be dynamic and rangy. I had an old boss who used to talk about ranginess. And if you can range up and down from complex to simple, you can solve a lot of problems. And you can have, rather than a yes or no solution, it's always a yes, but it's what level of yes do you want to get to at any point in time. And I find selling, like, with the presumption that you're going to buy, it's just what are you going to buy, is a lot easier than are you going to buy something or not. Um,
Yeah.
and which I think is a big difference between the services side. So when we work with our services partners here, you think, okay, it's important that they understand what we do, and we put all of our effort into the product that we have. But from their perspective, it's actually quite simple. Like, our product is pretty simple. Let's not over complexify that part of it. Let's get complex about their side of the business, because that's where they're making their money, and that's where they're going to deal with the client side.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think like it's great to hear, like you say, the broad spectrum of services opportunities. And like it's not just horizontal and vertical expansion. It's like you can almost go in every different direction, and very often, big services businesses will spin up new practices to solve customer problems. You can hire people to solve the problems and be very flexible. I think most people that are working in a tech company and trying to partner with a services company are in the middle of the effort of helping that services company spin up a new offering around their product. Hopefully they've already got a complementary offering. Like if you're working with a Salesforce implementation consultant and you're like Outreach or Spec It or someone like that, it's like, hey, you're already doing Salesforce, and you could probably like bridge out a little bit to
Yeah.
offer these additional services. But it is difficult to kind of drive that change within one of these businesses. And I like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, what's a smart approach to encourage that change?
Well, so what you said, I think there are two, like there is building a practice with a services firm is one angle. The other angle is, does the product slot in really easily
Hmm.
already? So I think maybe I don't think about that as building a practice or not, but rather, is it a complementary add-on, or can we make the big effort to build a go-to-market offer? So in our case, we're working with big services firms and small services firms, and I think if I look back at any lessons we've learned, we've taken too simplistic of an answer with some of the big ones. We know how we sell to the customers that the big consulting firms also sell to, but it's not easy to get their attention. Not that you can't get their attention. I think maybe that's a misnomer. You can get their attention, but the lifespan of that attention is super short.
Yeah.
Great product. Customers might need your great product. I don't see a 5 to 10 to $20 million book of business built around this. We're not going to talk a whole lot anymore. And so that's kind of a mistake that we've made, is thinking, you have a big business, services business here. We have a great tech product that fits it. Let's combine efforts. That's really hard. What's
Hmm.
worked better for us is trying to find somebody who's got the wherewithal, whether it's at a big firm or a small firm, to say, I have a business now doing, we're in the HR space, so doing some sort of HR advisory work about whatever HR process there is. But I can pivot it in a different direction, or I can have a go to market offer that's a package that I don't already have. and
Mm.
that I can start to think about as like a net new stream that isn't otherwise there. Otherwise, influencing the bigger firms to add you in for a little bit of extra is it's not impossible, but you're not. It does work, but it's a lot of effort, and the ROI is probably zero. You don't make more than you would have otherwise if you just did it yourself.
Yeah, yeah, it's an interesting point, and it's really an uphill battle. And so, like with that package, like a bundled solution, like give me an example. Do you have a partner of Betterworks at the moment that is working in that way, or like in a previous company where you can think, hey, like that was a really good package or bundled solution that worked really well?
Yeah, there's probably several examples that I could talk to. I think but let me go back to another point. How do we figure out which ones we're gonna pursue? So think about like the big five management consulting firms. So we work with I'd say three of the big five, but we haven't cracked the we can work with them on a bundled solution yet. We have that is I'd love tips from the audience on how to do that part better. I think a lot of people would like to figure out how to do that part better. But what we found in the interim is if we bring Intel to a big consultant about a client that we're already engaged with, even if we're really early stage, we get attention and can have a pretty productive discussion. There's no inherent competitiveness to it. But we have to start that conversation. We haven't
Yeah.
figured out how to have that conversation come to us. On the flip side, we've had a couple other, and I'll give you a specific example. We don't sell, our core sales team doesn't sell directly into a couple industries. We don't sell directly into nonprofit education. We don't sell directly into the
Hmm.
government. And we sell into hospitals, but we probably could do better there. And so we're building a partnership with a firm who specializes in hospitals. And so we're taking the approach of limited number of partners. Limited means one in this case, with an offer that is coordinated from the get go that we can jointly go out and sell together. And so it's a very deliberate approach. It took us a long time to get to the point to try something like that. But it's a market that both sides see as fruitful, and it adds to business on both sides, additional to what we would otherwise see if we spent the time in some other way. So I think we're taking it right now from, are there industries like that we could pick off, that are, that would be net generative for us. But then the other, then we're still going back to, how do we coordinate on a deployment effort with somebody who's already there. And so it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, yeah, super, super interesting. I think that like well, I've talked to a few different folks about this, and it's definitely a difficult nut to crack. Like we're at Deal at the moment, we're fortunate enough that we do have quite a large amount of services that people look for along with our product, and we have the opportunity to give that business to the big firms. And so like we're still navigating those conversations at the moment where it's like, hey, like this is a $5 to $10 million business that we're going to give you, like you're welcome.
Yeah.
And in exchange, like we do want to be set up as a real partner and have like a real exchange of value. And so I think it's like we're in a really fortunate position with that, which I haven't ever been in the past. And also we're in a real fortunate position where our internal services organization is like very positive and actually proactive about getting these partners involved. Whereas in historical companies I worked in, there was a really big services opportunity, but like whether it was the success team or the professional services team or whoever else, like they were very protective of that
Yeah.
body of work, and they didn't want to give it out, which that's a conversation for another day. But it definitely impeded our ability to be able to be successful with those kind of motions.
Yeah.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit because I wanted to talk to you about your experience as a revenue leader and like how that has impacted your approach to partnerships. And I'll just give a little context because we were talking before we started recording about this, and my read, especially on the change in the macroeconomic conditions we're in right now, is like businesses are being very specific about what they need from go-to-market teams, which is like, hey, really, we're looking for like scalable, efficient teams that ideally are a profit center for the business. And I think if people, a lot of the time when people have spent their whole life in partnerships, it's really easy for them to get into the mentality of, okay, well, I'm going to have a retention goal with the product team, and I'm going to have like this goal with the success team and this goal with the marketing team, and then hopefully we can help the sales team win some deals, and like they're working their tail off to tick all of these boxes, and then at the end of the day the business is still like, is the partnerships team really adding any value? And after working as a revenue leader myself and then coming back into partnerships, my perspective on this thing, I saw myself in the past doing all of that stuff, and then saw myself now, and like, none of that is what the business needs,
Yeah.
pretty much, and given that you've kind of come from this revenue leadership background and now into a partnerships role, I'd love to hear your perspective on that, of like, what does the business need, and like, what was your expectation of partnerships in the business?
Yeah, well, I can't. I have to admit that in my early days, I ran into a bit of that too. This is the first partnership role that I've had, and so you come in and you say, "Well, how can we impact sales? How can we impact customer? How can we impact product?" And you do end up spreading yourself pretty wide, pretty wide or pretty thin, right? You're seeing across a lot, but it's not making the impact that you thought. One realization that I had when we came into this business was, if we have services partners, those services partners can help get us into customers that we're not already in. At the same time, we have customers that need help from those services partners, and we can make that a reciprocal quid pro quo. Sounds like a good equitable trade-off. The reality of the business here is that our existing customers are pretty happy. We don't really have churn or retention issues. They ask us for things once in a while, but it's ad hoc. And so what you realize is, if I try to spend time solving something that is customer oriented, which may sound a little odd to some people, I'm actually solving for a problem that we don't really have right now, and I don't actually know that our customers have. So it didn't take too long to realize this, but what we start to see is we need almost like a Rolodex of folks or firms or specialists, so that when our customers need something, that we have an answer for them. Before I got here, we had no answer, and now we have answers. However, if you look at the real impact on the business, that's a very small part of the business, because we're selling to medium and large enterprise. If they have a problem, and we're in the performance management space. So if somebody comes to us and asks us about compensation, first of all, they don't typically come to us and ask us about compensation, because they're big enough to have compensation experts. So we can prepare all around this for the customers that ask us, but it's not going to be a big part of the business. On the flip side, the partnerships function here reports into sales, and so you can tell what the biggest part of the business the biggest part of the business is, and so we can redirect our effort on essentially lead gen. Essentially, how do we get something in? But it's not as simple as lead gen. There are times where I think we are glorified SDRs. And I think if we're doing our job really, really well, that is kind of what we're doing. We're handing over connected, friendly, somewhat qualified opportunities with a bunch more background than you typically get, right to the sales team. And the close rates on those are significantly higher, but it is like being an SDR, an SDR function. And so I think about it like that. And I have a background in sales, like you said, and I actually like that. Like it's a great way to serve up. Like our biggest customer that we have was served up in a model like that. A lot of work with the consulting firm. All of a sudden, the right dots connected, and here you go, sales team. And then the sales team. I don't want to underplay how hard it was for the sales team to work it from there, but it's the biggest deal we've ever done.
Yeah.
And the actual role I played was kind of like an SDR, and I'm proud that we were able to work it like that.
Yeah, I think there's no shame in that game. Like that is, I feel exactly the same way. Where it's like, hey, our job is to source revenue opportunities for the business.
But to your point though, the alternative on time could be spent thinking about product partnerships, right? I could spend a lot of time on product partnerships. I spend some time on product partnerships, but I could spend more. Or on adjacency, adjacent tech partners that our customers might buy from. I mean, our customers are buying from a lot of other folks too. What we've chosen to do is to spend, I don't have a number on it, but I'd say it's 20% of the time on those things, so that when somebody calls me and needs an answer, I have an answer fast.
Yeah.
But 80% of the time is spent on the revenue side, on the net new side.
Yeah. I
So
think
we're
it's
all
really
aligned.
smart. It's
Yeah,
really smart because the reality is that unless you're at a company where they're like, hey, we have a customer expansion, engagement, retention problem, and they're like, we our new business pipeline is crushing, it's perfect, like
yeah,
we're bringing in as many leads as we could possibly handle, infinite new prospects, and actually our problem is that they're churning because we don't have XYZ features,
yeah,
or like they're not expanding because like our product is limited or whatever. Like, I haven't run into it yet,
yeah,
but like maybe one day, but like it seems pretty rare. Like what I encounter is, we want partners because we want to generate more revenue.
yeah,
And like when people get away from that, or also think, hey, like there's any shame in being seen as a pipeline channel. Like, there's no shame in being a marketer or being an SDR, or like, there's like, I love SDRs.
yeah,
Like I love working with SDRs. They're the best of the best. And it's just like, hey, yeah, it's a pipeline channel, and but the opportunities close at a really high rate.
yeah,
And also quite often they're going to be big, interesting deals with like a lot of complexity.
yeah,
Like if someone's paying for a consultant, or like a services partner or something else, like there's probably some interesting stuff going on in that deal where it's going to be a larger deal, most
yeah.
likely, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's putting your product and the pricing pressure that I mean, everybody has a range that they can reasonably operate in, and then trying to put it in the context of the bigger issue. So I'll give it from where we are now. We're a best of breed in the HR tech space, and so
Mm-hmm.
we have upper bounds to our pricing, and we have something that looks not serious. So we have a range that we operate in. And we'll get caught up in that range a little bit, as if we think the customer really gets caught up in that range. At the
Mm-hmm.
same time, what we're probably fighting against more than we give ourselves credit for is that they have a $20 million core HR installation that isn't giving them what they need. And so the context for us is significantly less than that, compared to the way they think about it is, this is the way they think about the size of the issue, and we can come along. It's almost like, one way I think about it sometimes, for better or for worse, is like, think of the US mail infrastructure. We've spent billions of dollars to have mail delivered to every address in America, and it costs a lot to operate that. If the mailman, though, delivers the mail to your doorstep and it's raining outside, and they leave it like outside on the sidewalk, you get mad at the mail system. You don't. You might not get. You probably get mad at the mailman too, but you get mad at the whole system. But what went wrong there was really like a last mile decision. But so the context of the mail is this massive multi-billion-dollar thing, and you solve an end user problem, which makes the whole thing feel better. And so there's a category. I think there's a lot of, not everybody's in that category, but there's a lot of companies in that category where that allows you to say, my product might be $10,000, might be $100,000, might be $1,000,000. That's the way we think about it and live and breathe it every day. But if the context of what that problem is solving for is a $50 million problem, then the conversations with customers are at the $50 million range. So this is kind of a no brainer if we get to that point. So
Yeah.
we've learned that lesson. I don't know if we're perfect at it, but we've learned that lesson and are getting better at kind of like, what we do is what we do. We do it really well. Let's look at the magnitude of impact that this could possibly have.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I know you talked a little bit about, again, as we were getting warmed up, you mentioned doing what the company needs now,
Yeah,
but also having a pulse on what the company needs in the future. That's like the top tip whenever I have a call with like a new partnerships person, or like, who's moving into a VP or head of role. I'm like, figure out what the company needs,
yeah,
like figure out what the metric is that if you don't crush it, like you'll get fired, you know, and then cross that metric, you know. And so like I really liked how you articulated doing what the company needs now, but also like having a lens on what the company needs for the
Yeah.
future. Like, tell me more about that. How do you think about that?
I mean, when I first joined, I think having a partnership person relatively early on in a company like ours is a super smart move. I joined because I think it's a smart move, and the company thought it was a smart move. But the first thing I did was sit down with the functional stakeholders and ask what their expectations of the partnership's role were. And you know what I got more than anything was, I'm not quite sure. So everybody knew we needed it. Everybody thought we needed it, but there was no definition of it other than we want this to help us. And there's a negative side of the story too, which is I've probably tried to do everything here, and most of that we've stopped trying to do. We've
Uh-huh.
tried, well, we've tried everything we've tried resellers, we've tried embedding, we've tried all these things. We've tried referrals, we've tried big consulting work, we've tried bundling offers. I talked to one partner one time, and we were going down this: what if we put your thought leadership and our thought leadership, and we got down this path of what co-marketing would look like.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually kind of snapped at me, and he said, "We're going to waste each other's time if your main function is lead gen and my main function is lead gen, and the primary thing we're talking about is thought leadership. And that doesn't mean that thought leadership isn't important, but it means that the primary thing we should talk about is lead gen. And if that
Mm-hmm.
leads us to thought leadership, then great. Otherwise, we need to get back to the core." And so, for the conversation I have here, when I started, I didn't have any goals, so I set
Mm-hmm.
myself a quota. I was like, I need a quota. Why is the quota? What you said. Because I don't have a better answer. Do you have a better answer? No. So let's put our stake in the ground, and we can adjust from there. So we set a quota for a couple years. And we tried to meet that quota through referrals from partners, partner source, partner influence. I measured it all. I did it in spreadsheets and some in Salesforce, like probably a lot of people are trying to figure out how to do. And then what we said was that quota is leading us to be aggressive over getting deals in from partners, which like all sounds logical. Um, at the same time, we were thinking about these ultra large deals. Some of our biggest deals in the world are with some of the biggest companies in the world. Those probably aren't coming in from the same type of referral partners that we're measuring against our quota. So what if we stop the quota and say, let's use we also sell OKR software. Let's use the OKR principle to say, for this quarter and next quarter, what are our primary priorities from a business standpoint above the quota bit? And it allows us to say, we think the work with a Deloitte or an Accenture or an EY, we think that's like a 3-year thing. And if we're
Mm-hmm.
quota oriented, we're never going to get to that. So how do we manage that part of the business, which is long term, while providing some air cover over the short term? And
Yeah.
so maybe going quota first was smart, because it allowed us to build a cadre of folks that are a little bit more coin operated. At the same time, it gave us space to think about what's going to impact us a year later, and in fact helped drive the biggest deal we've ever had, which I think I've said a couple times. But it was only made possible by operating at two levels, multiple levels at the same time, but being attentive to what we need right now with an eye on the future, so to speak.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I love that. And then, like, how do you keep a pulse on that? Is it like who are you working with in the senior leadership level to make sure that like your read on what the business needs now
Yeah,
continues to be? Just because like companies are changing so quickly,
yeah,
right? Like people are realizing, hey, we need to reduce our burn rate, or like we're not going to be able to raise capital as easy as we did previously, or this kind of business that like this part of the business isn't as efficient as we thought, or like all of this different stuff. Like, how are you keeping a good pulse on what the business needs now?
yeah. I think there's one is, how do you keep track of it all? And so I hate to say it, but I just have massive spreadsheets with all the people that I've talked to in categories of their companies, and who's friendly, who's not friendly, who's competitive, who's not, so that if any point in time there's a question, who's a learning provider in Europe we could work with, like I have answers to stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of the I'd almost call that the groundwork that nobody ever sees. Like I don't have any reason to show it to anybody, but it's there. And so there's a
Yeah.
piece of that which is there. The second part, which I think is maybe the more important answer to your question, I work for our chief revenue officer. So I'm on, so I know what the deal. So I keep a pulse on what our deals are. We have partners involved in a lot of our deals. So I sit in on the forecast calls, and then I was in sales, so I work directly with a lot of the sales folks on the team. However, we raise it up once a month, and we spend an hour and a half once a month with the chief revenue officer, chief marketing officer, chief product officer, our head of transformation strategy, and our CEO. And that is the place where I have a chance to start to prioritize. There's all these different categories we could spend time on. Do we think that spending our effort on boutique regional agencies is the right place to go? Do we think spending time on the large global consulting firms is the time to go? Do we want to pick off a country and try to take a country that we know we have a good fit in, but we don't have sales presence in?
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with product. It gives the ability to bring the product partnership discussions to life. So how much effort are we putting into certain product categories? And more importantly, on the product side, who's leading that part? Is that being led by the partnerships function, or is that actually being led by the product function? And
Yeah.
throw in, you want to make it even messier, throw in things like influencers and analysts. I'm in a position in the partnerships role. I know all the influencers and analysts better than a lot of people do, but the marketing team owns the influencer and analyst strategy. And so I think you have to have some humility to not need to own anything, but you should own something. But at any given moment, like that could change. And so we align on that once a month. I mean, an hour and a half from our CEO once in a month, I'm very grateful for. But that's where I have the ability to say, I think we got some time-based trade-offs to make. Where do we see the next couple months going? And then if it's not prioritized for the next quarter, let's say, doesn't mean it goes away. It just means it goes to ground for a little bit, and we try to put some time in, but not visible, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that humility is really important. Like, it's probably one of the biggest learnings that I've had prior to starting at Deal, and that I've implemented here is like, when you're in partnerships, you're out in the world and you're meeting experts like on the cutting edge of every single facet that your business touches, right? So you are ultimately just going to be much more knowledgeable about the customer problems and the ecosystem that exists than anyone else in your business by like a factor of 10,
Yeah.
right? Like, it's like you're Neo in the Matrix, and everyone else is like normal people in the machine, almost. Like that's what it feels like sometimes when you you're just
Yeah.
you're spending so much time in customer problems that even your customer success team just wouldn't even know about, right? Because it's like it doesn't touch your product, and so I think it's really then difficult to know that and also know, hey, like it's not your place to like interfere and try and like get people to know what you know, or like or also, hey, like you might have that information but it still might not mean that like the way that you action that data is the correct way, like the marketing team might still be right even if they don't know what and like having that level of humility I think is really important, because it's really easy to start damaging relationships if you're just like, hey, product team, you should prioritize these integrations because like I know it all, or like, hey, marketing team, like everyone else is doing this, like you should do this, like it's a very easy path to go down, and also a really dangerous one for partnerships people, I think.
Yeah, I mean, if it's almost like my priority is that we have an answer that we agree on, but it doesn't matter what the answer is at any given moment. So, use your product integration standpoint. We tend to lean towards what our customers ask us for to prioritize product integrations, but we also put a lot of emphasis on what the sales team is hearing from a product standpoint. However, the sales team hears things different than the customers hear things, right? And so you put those two things together, and I would add a third layer to that, which is the impact on our future strategy from a product standpoint, even if customers aren't asking for it or the sales team isn't hearing it. And so I think of the iPad example, right? The first iPad was launched and it was a flop. And if you went around and asked customers about the iPad, you'd get like, we don't really need that. But there's enough belief in that to launch it again, and all of a sudden it's one of the best selling things out there, and help lift Apple. And so I think that's not suggesting that that's what we do all the time, but there's an element of like, what do customers need that we can fulfill, what helps the sales team sell more, and what positions us for the future. Whether it's for acquisition, whether it's for partnerships we can't get now but we want to get in the future, all of that stuff goes in. So I don't care what the answer is. What I care is that we've thought through it in a way that says, right now, here's our focus, and we have some reasonable consensus around what it's going to be, and then we can, quarter to quarter, things can change pretty quickly.
Yeah, awesome. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. But last question I'd love to dig into before we go is a question we ask all of our guests. What is something that you learned recently that you'd like to share with the audience?
It's I'm a maybe this is the sales background in me, Colin, but I'm a big believer in repetition, and one of the things that I learned in sales is if you can't go do it 50 times, you can't have an opinion on it. And so what I've started to apply in partnerships is you got to go do something 50 times before you can draw any sort of reasonable
Hmm.
conclusion on it. And
Hmm.
so that is in a game where you feel like you have a limited swing. As a big consultant, you got one big shot. How do you find a way to turn that big shot into 50 attempts before you take the big shot? It can take a little bit of time and effort, but that's the like 50 to 1 principle that I found is helpful here. 50 boutique agencies before I take my big shot at a big global firm, like as an example. And it gets your talk track, it gets your thinking, it gets all the problems out of the way. Then you naturally come more cleaner on it.
Yeah, I love that. I've heard it quantified as like a number of hours, like 1,000 hours to mastery or something like that as well. I really like that. Like 50 times seems a lot more actionable than 1,000 hours. So I absolutely love that one. All right, well, Dustin, thank you so much for your time. Super insightful, and really appreciate it. And I know that. We're also looking to partner together, so I'm very excited for that as well. And that's probably something we can share back with folks on a future episode.
Yeah, you bet, Ty. I'm excited about the journey and your journey and what you're doing here. So thanks a ton, and thanks for having me.
Amazing. All right. Thank you.